Well, I was kind of curious about asking kind of why you're doing all these things. Like, what is the thing that is really you're trying to meet or that you're trying to, tackle in the world?
Yeah, I couldn't think of anything better, so I figured why not. No, I yeah, there's a lot of different ways I could go at that question. I think probably based on some of the things we'll get into, I can go a little bit more esoteric than in other contexts. So um, the so what in that mode would be something like I think that an emerging sense of God or the divine is taking shape in society as it always has historically, and that calls forth a kind of participatory gesture. That's not something you can just sit back and watch. Like, it doesn't happen unless you get involved and participate in it happening. And through, yeah, kind of just the unfolding of my own life trajectory, I started to realize the importance of that as a phenomenon, and then starting to realize that it is happening in some really important and profound way. So in that kind of esoteric framing of it, I would say something like the most important thing I think any human being can do is rise to a certain kind of calling, a vocation whereby you are of service to the divine by helping the divine realize and manifest itself in a novel, creative way that has never occurred before, and to, in a sense, yeah, be of service to that emergent potential of the next thing in the emergence of the sacred. So that would be sort of the kind of say sacramental or kind of like religious languaging for that at that level. But then there are much more kind of secular, mundane ways of speaking about this, right? I mean, um, you could step back and say, I think that we need a paradigm shift, in our forms of knowledge and
Mhm.
the way that we make sense of the world. I think that's urgently needed. And I think when we look out at the world, we see a very broken, crazy, chaotic place that seems to be going in many ways in the wrong direction. And so I think that calls forth a sense of like, I need to do something. I need to do whatever I can. And I think that a big part of that is just that our ways of seeing the world and our ways of thinking about things is no longer uh, it doesn't make the cut when it comes to the level of complexity that now we're facing. So I see that as being another way of thinking about what we need to be doing and what I'm interested to help, help bring about. Um, and I guess, yeah, one final way of framing it, which is somewhere maybe between the esoteric and the more kind of just mundane, paradigmatic ways of thinking about things, is like, I do like John Vervaeke's framing of this meaning crisis, and that's something that I've experienced. And meaning and how we make meaning and what meaning is and all of that has become really the focus of my life's work. And so I feel a kind of calling to do what I can to contribute to our engagement with that topic, right? And to not just at an intellectual level, but at a really deep, visceral, felt, embodied, existential level, right? If people are suffering, if people are engaged in this collective meaning crisis and experiencing, diseases of despair and this sort of a thing, right? Like, that's real, and I can phenomenologically relate to a lot of that as well. And then I feel a sense that is there anything I can do to help people with that process? Um, and I feel like over the course of my life, relatively short as it's been, I've come to some realizations along the way, and I feel like these I would have really loved to have known this 10, 15, 20 years ago. So
Mm.
there's a desire to want to kind of share that and articulate it. So yeah, meaning, paradigm shift, bringing God into the world in a new form. Those are all kind of my jam.
Yeah, I love it. I love that you brought all three of those as well, because I was thinking that it'd be possible that you could just talk about the meaning crisis. That's the way I've heard a lot of people talking about this recently. But it sounds like you're almost like the way that I'm interpreting some of what you're saying, and that I bring it into my own. Well, I have just come back from a festival that's all around how do we deal with the meaning crisis? How do we support each other to create, like, in the same way, create community? We're building this together, and how do we part of answering the question is, and I think integral theory and metamodernism offer some of this knowledge as well. It's kind of like this embodied epistemology. It's kind of like, oh, I've got these different ways of taking in information, and how can I find even more ways of taking information, or how can and interpreting that information and making meaning out of that, especially with your description of listening to something bigger than yourself and being kind of a catalyst for those forces, and like knowing that in order to truly express those forces in the world, you yourself have to be a good vehicle for that, and that requires various different kinds of personal work as well. So yeah, really cool to hear you talk about it in those different ways. And yeah, I'd love to hear a bit more about how you feel metamodernism explicitly kind of offers to those different positions.
Yeah, and maybe just to add a little bit of framing there, because I definitely I love what you like, the explanation you gave. It really resonated with me in terms of the calling, speaking about feeling called, to be of service, and to participate in the unfolding and the realization, I guess, of that transcendent, or all of that really speaks to me and resonates with my experience. But also, I also am left feeling like conceptually I'm still not, I still don't fully understand like what is, because part of what I kind of understood the question that Alexander was asking is kind of like, how would you relate, I guess, your project, as a philosopher, as a thinker, and I guess like because the general stuff about participatory, a way of existing and the vocation, all of that makes sense to me. But how does metamodernism in particular like speak to and serve as a vehicle for that?
Yeah, I think it sounds like you and your audiences will be familiar with that integral framing as well, and so there's a lot of overlap there in a similar way, which I think carries over. I came into this line of inquiry apart from my own kind of existential crises and grappling with issues of meaning in that way, but actually really as a direct result of that, through the question of what is this postmodern world that we're supposedly living in. I mean, this would have been back in 2010, 2011. I looked around and I felt like that there was a cultural version of what I was experiencing individually. That there was some way in which this death of God experience, this loss of meaning, and this loss of religion, spirituality that I underwent, in my early 20s, let's say, had a collective version. And again, this was before I, discovered any of these really helpful models later on about this stuff. It just seemed like, oh yeah, well, when we look back at what we've been through, in a sense, world historically, I guess you could say, that there's been some kind of a progression from this worldview of, just a rich fullness of meaning everywhere to this sort of disenchanted existence. And Charles Taylor, for example, in The Secular Age, or there's a great book I've got called God's Funeral, maps this historically really well. It's a simple story, and in some ways can be overdone, right? And even people I'm very close with and whose work I really admire a lot, like Jason Storm, I think would challenge aspects of this story. But I think the basic version of it, I feel very confident, has some real merit to it, which is that collectively, yeah, you compare the modern worldview and its kind of materialistic, reductionistic, atheistic, deterministic orientation to reality, to a, let's say, I don't know, high medieval Dantean kind of neo-Aristotelian, Neoplatonic. The world is full of levels of being that rise up to ultimate reality, that is ultimate bliss and insight and wisdom and all this stuff. Like, that's a profound break. And even though my brand of religiosity that I, grew up in and left was not necessarily that, it was more specifically a kind of like evangelical Christianity, there was still a sense that in that worldview, things were meaningful and they were rich and they had significance and this sort of a thing. And in this period of modernity, we'd sort of lost something like that. This disenchantment had happened, and so. That was sort of the context for my understanding of a lot of this stuff as I tried to make sense of it myself. And then I tried to kind of do a investigatorial, like who done it, right? Like how did this happen? Who killed God, so to speak, right? And and then it becomes a sort of historical question of like how do you trace this unfolding in history? Um, and so the connection I guess I'm trying to make is that I think that there is a real parallel or analog or isomorphism between that individual experience of a meaning crisis and historioculturally, where whole groups of people have moved and shifted in their worldview from one structure to another with attendant consequences. And so for me, the question then was sort of, okay, interesting. At the collective level, how do we understand this? This is some kind of move from a pre-modern um, kind of religious orientation to reality, however we want to conceive of that, into a modern sort of disenchanted, kind of mechanistic worldview. And then onward still, right? Because then you get post-modernity and you get a kind of radicalization of some of those ideas and a negation of them in others, but a whole new level of disillusionment and deconstruction and that sort of thing, right? And so, yeah, for me, the question became in some ways historicized, and I was interested in it from that angle. So, metamodernism came to on my radar as a result of that project. It was sort of people exploring what comes after postmodernism, and this was mind you before Hansi Freinacht. This was early cultural studies metamodernism, and what I found in the people talking about metamodernism was a worldview that was much more of the sort that I would hope to see emerging beyond postmodernism, right? It probably wouldn't have resonated with me the way other theories do like, or that have been proposed, like hypermodernism, digimodernism, these kinds of other things that are sort of like, no, things just keep going and they get more extreme and, more detachment from reality. And, it's like, it was, okay, that's an interesting theory. But with metamodernism, there actually seemed to be something rather hopeful in here because there was a marked kind of return of engagements with grand narratological thinking, meaning, myth, but in a very nuanced way that carried forward the insights of postmodernism and therefore wasn't reactionary. And so all of that was really, it spoke to me about what this move could look like. And it also just, yeah, resonated with my own initial attempts to do that. So I think that the project that I'm engaged in as being situated within metamodernism is important because I think that does a lot of conceptual work to frame the suppositions involved here, right? It is something that's progressive in nature, that in a sense God has to die, at least as God was, that there is no going back. There is no kind of reactionary move that will just return us to some, paradisal past or something, but that things move and change and evolve. And sometimes that's messy, sometimes it hurts, but through the process, new things emerge that are genuinely developmental and progressive, that are able to bring to mind and awareness new levels of reality that we hadn't seen before. And that a lot of this process could be interpreted as part of a bigger structure of how the universe itself kind of unfolds. And so I found that very compelling, and that is very much the vision that I'm trying to articulate here.
Sure.
And so just, yeah, I guess last thought on that is just for me, notions of developing the divine, shifting the paradigm, updating our understanding of reality and helping people with the meaning crisis can be understood as a movement through cultural evolution that reaches certain contradictions, dialectical ruptures, right? That we have a map. We can begin to sense that we have a map for navigating these things, and that it leads in a certain direction. And so hopefully that can a little bit tie some of those things together. But there's a lot in the mix there. I happy to.
It was quite a good thorough explanation. I might just echo back to you what I think I heard, and then ask you a question about it. So I think I heard you say that, and the thing I want to ask a question about is whether this is more a description of your motivations and your reasons for being involved in metamodernism, or whether you think this is an appraisal of metamodernism as a phenomenon, or it's something, I guess, over and above you and your engagement with it. I kind of heard you describe metamodernism almost like as a way, either a way to respond or as a response to, kind of like a way of re-enchanting the world, but with an emphasis on not back but through, right? Like not trying to go back to what we had, which, you know, in some sense was primitive. There's a reason we outgrew that, right? But just recognizing that there's something about this swing of the pendulum that's gone a bit too far, you know, and that's kind of, there are consequences of that we're seeing. And then I guess it seems like you're pointing towards metamodernism as like a consolidated set of attempts to overcome that recognition.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of phrasing a lot of that. I mean, yeah, I would say, I guess I'll come back to whether it's me or whether it's broader. But I would say, yes, that there is an attempt to respond to, let's say, the disenchantment with a re-enchantment, but in a way that it's sort of, you can't put the genie back in the bottle, right? Like once you learn that Santa Claus isn't real, you know, that might be really disappointing. Oh, by the way, sorry, spoiler alert. I don't know if who's listening, but once you learn that, right, it's yeah, that can be really disillusioning. But I guess the sort of argument that I would say is that that is both a necessary disillusionment in the sense that it brings you deeper into alignment with reality, but also those feelings of frustration, anger, disappointment, what have you, are not the terminus of that process, that is a phase in a broader process that is a developmental process, such that you can get on the other side of that and you can see a different kind of enchantment to reality. It's a little hard to use the Santa Claus example, but maybe something like, right, a boy thinks that Santa Claus exists. One day he learns that that's not the case. 15 years later, 30 years later, I don't know what the time would be. They grow up and they have their own family, and now that what had been the boy is a father, and he is in a sense playing Santa Claus, right, by taking a nibble of the cookie or whatever, and you know, and that is its own form of magic and enchantment, and in a sense a much richer, more encompassing one, or I don't know, a more kind of frequent, more familiar example might be the pains of puberty. No one really enjoys their period of that transformation and all the awkwardness of middle school and all that, right? It's a really sucky time. But I think most people would say it's for the best, right? That what comes on the other side of that is sort of worth those growing pains, literally. And I want to say something similar about, you know, our conceptions of the sacred and the divine, and meaning that, yes, that we have kind of progressively outgrown older forms of thinking about these things. And at least my experience of that was profoundly painful, destabilizing, disorienting, vertiginous. But with time, and as you integrate those insights and ideas, you get to the other side of something that's so much richer and more full. And that's the thing that I'm trying to gesture to explain, to think about, to theologize about in some ways. So that's basically the idea, and it's just kind of a rehashing maybe of what you already said. And in terms of whether it's just me, I don't think it's just me. I mean, I think I wouldn't resonate with this movement so broadly if it didn't have in some kernel form that structure to it fundamentally, right? And I think there are different ways that comes out. There are also, as I've written about in my book on metamodernism, different strands of people talking about metamodernism for whom developmental theories are much more emphasized than others. But even in the folks who are looking at the art or the philosophy, I think that there is a, if not a deep structure, a continuity and a sort of strand that does make a fabric that ties these things together in some meaningful way. Now, historically speaking, movements may have tenuous threads that connect various aspects of what's moving ahead. Modernity itself, right, was characterized by all sorts of different kinds of philosophies: empiricism, idealism, Kantian, transcendental idealism, various kinds of ways you could be a modernist. But there was also a deeper continuity there to what that general movement meant into what people conceptualized
Yeah.
as the Enlightenment. I think something similar is kind of true of metamodernism.
Something that I was thinking about while you were talking, just I guess ruminating on the example you gave of Santa Claus, is I was thinking a little bit about the description you're giving, and part of the reason that I was really excited to have you on is I watched your talk with, I think his name is James, called Critiquing Metamodernism, I think.
Oh yeah, James Cusson, yeah.
Yeah, great talk. But yeah, something that I was thinking about was, you talk a bit about like how to define metamodernism and I guess its relationship with postmodernism, and you contextualize postmodernism with this. This isn't the only thing you link it to, but I'm just focusing in on the thing I think is relevant. With this distrust of grand narratives, and then and I heard you say, either in the talk today or in the book, I've got in my head that you have this thought that that there's a kind of a turning back towards a notion of grand narratives. But it makes me think of something to do with the Santa Claus example, which is until you stop blindly believing it, you can't play with the idea. Like you can't decide to consciously believe for the purposes of teaching your child, for example.
Yeah.
Like there's a way in which your ability to engage with the idea is limited by your unquestioning belief in it. And when you open yourself up and see it for what it is, that doesn't mean you can't use it anymore. It actually frees you up to engage with it in a more rich way.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that versions of that dynamic characterize pretty much every form of growth, including even kind of classic Freudian notions, right? That aren't necessarily developmental in the kind of constructivist tradition, but something like, until you see your neurosis, you're bound to kind of, live through it. And so a lot of the healing process, and this relates to trauma, I think, as well in its own way, right? It's like, you will live out something until you are able to, in some ways, step back from it to take it as an object of awareness, at which point new things become possible and you gain a new kind of freedom. And that freedom can include playing with things, right, in the way that you're talking about. They can even, and this is probably one of the more controversial approaches to metamodernism, but in some ways it's kind of the oldest, which is some people can just say, yeah, well, that's what I want to do. I want to suspend disbelief, and I want to live in that reality frame, and I know that I'm doing that. And the very fact that you know you're doing that means you're doing something different than if you didn't know you were doing that.
Yeah.
So
It feels.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say that kind of reminds me of Aleister Crowley used to talk about kind of putting on these masks and going out into high society and playing these different roles. And I know that the typing systems have been a very big psychoactive for me, and the integral theory has been a big psychoactive, and I imagine metamodernism is also a psychoactive. And this idea of psychoactive feels very relevant here as well. Like there's something that pulls us out of our normal world and shines a light on the things that we're embodying unconsciously.
Yeah.
I
think a lot of so it was an interesting sort of Rorschach test, because many people didn't really know what to do with the Hansi Freinacht stuff in the more original forms of metamodernism. Some people were very put off by it, not just because of the ideas, but they were like, I don't understand. He's not actually named Hansi Freinacht, but he's playing with his identity. Like there was just like an inability to appreciate, this move that was being made, which I found kind of ironic. But that was what I think was genuinely, in that original sense, metamodern about Hansi Freinacht's work. Was he was like, look, the fiction is itself a mask that we can choose to put on to reveal deeper realities, right? And so I think that that form of play, that serious play, you could say, is something genuinely progressive, right? Because that, in some ways, stereotyping the kind of classic postmodern move, it's just to say, oh, we're all wearing a mask, everything's fake, everything's an illusion, we're all psychopaths or something, or at the very least, like, there is no depth, there is no mask, we're only the mask. These kinds of things, these were problematizing these kinds of distinctions. But I think once you get that, then you don't just stay there. You're like, oh, okay, yeah, I get that now. Well, what can I do with this? How do I play with this? And it becomes its own new set of methods, of artistic strategies, of philosophical ideas. And in that sense, because it couldn't have occurred before and it needs to have emerged from what's been, there's something, I think, really progressive there. And a lot of my work drawing on other thinkers like Wilber, certainly. I always want to say that now because people are like, Brendan's just saying what Ken Wilber is saying. It's like, okay, I got to give credit to Ken Wilber. Definitely an influence. But certainly beyond Ken Wilber as well. I mean, there's a broad dialectical tradition in philosophy that goes obviously back to Hegel, if not earlier, where these kinds of moves were starting to be, were themselves coming into consciousness, right?
Definitely.
And so anyway, I think that there's something deeply at the core of this metamodern move in appreciating these sorts of progressions in this way.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, this conversation with you has sold me more on the idea than all of my exposure prior to this. Just listening to you, explain it, I think I find it a lot more relatable, and I really resonate with what you're saying about serious play. And I guess to kind of extend the thing I was saying before about like consciously deciding to play. Specifically, the thing it makes me think about is something that I've been experimenting with for a few years now, which is telling a story about my life, which is like, the story is like, in a way, it's a fantasy, but it's a fantasy that has meaningful connections with like the actual life path that I want. And it's like, in a way, like in my own private space, I believe in that story in this kind of way where I know it's not really real. You know what I mean? It's not like I really believe it like a child would, but at the same time, I choose to believe it because the narrative structure gives utility to my life. So that participating in it and choosing to engage with it as if it's real, even though I know it's not, empowers me. And I think that's part of what you're pointing towards is this kind of recognition that, okay, a grand narrative, you don't have to like be bewitched by it in order to get the benefits of it. You can kind of hold it at an arm's length and say, I really love this grand narrative. It might not be true, but fuck it, really helps me to make sense of what's going on though,
Yeah, I think you just described metamodernism better than I have. So no, that's great. No, I think that's exactly right. And it does so many things. And again, there's so many aspects to this because, Hansi Freinacht does talk about this dynamic in his work, which is great. But like, again, years before I discovered Hansi, and the reason that I was attracted to metamodernism pre-Hansi is because it articulated a version of this, the as-if orientation. And what I'd written in the epic poem, for example, that I had explored a lot of these ideas in, basically was an embodied, version of this, so that when I found it articulated theoretically, I was like, oh my God, that's what I've been doing over here. So there's a there to this that transcends any particular lineage in the metamodern discourse. I think that there's something, that's that fabric that connects a lot of these different strands. But the other thing I wanted to say is that so the utility of things, well, stop me if I'm maybe going too far into the weeds here. If you want, we can, because I have a lot of thoughts on this phenomenon and the ways that it operates, the ways we see it playing out across metamodern culture, etc. But I also, maybe I don't need to.
I'm excited to hear your thoughts. This idea excites me. So
okay, so yeah, a mundane reflection of this in metamodern culture, which has nothing to do with developmental theory, but it's still there. There's been a classic recognition in metamodern cultural studies circles, whatever that means, that the Lego movie is a nice representation of metamodern thought, right? And in that movie, which is, it's a fun kind of kids but also adult movie, there's this prophecy, right? And the whole thing about the prophecy is that it directs this character and it moves him along his path. But then he finds out that the prophecy was all made up, right? And it's like, oh no, disillusionment, right? Oh, I was believing in a lie. But then, things go on, and then oh wait, well, without the prophecy having been made up, none of this would have happened. So there's the utility aspect there, right? And in fact, that we make real by inaction, right? That, like, in the sense of, if I say it is my fate tomorrow to go into town and buy some milk, right? I've decided this is my story. It's my story. I'm sticking to it. Was that Colin? Anyway, SNL guy. So this is my story. I'm sticking to it. This is my little personal myth, let's say, right? Now, tomorrow I go into town and I buy some milk. Fate realized, prophecy fulfilled, this sort of a thing, right? But there's a tautology here, right? Because, like, it's by living into the story that I've made something real, and without that story, it wouldn't have been real. And so retroactively, we can kind of confirm the deep truths of things by the ways in which we live into the world. And I think that there's actually maybe that sounds trite, but I think when people revisit spirituality, religion through this kind of orientation, they can start to say, especially if they've gone through a period of disillusionment and deconstruction, by living into a story, a richness can emerge out of my life that would not be made possible if I did not live as if this were true. And then what happened for me in a huge way was, if you start living as if some things are true, you can realize they're true, in a way that you never could if you never even just let yourself as if think it were true. So I started thinking that spirituality and meaning in general were orientations worth having for the kind of utilitarian reason that we're talking about. So I allowed myself an as if, sort of all right, well, I'm still going to believe this because I think this is the way I ought to go. And it was a sort of radical affirmationist, William James style, choosing to believe. Now, there's no way I could have ended up where I currently am if I hadn't made that initial move, which was sort of a leap of faith in a kind of Kierkegaardian sense, but not even a leap of faith in saying, I think this is real, I have no reason for it, but I'm going to affirm it. It's actually saying, I don't even think this is real, but I still think that I should affirm this, and so I'm going to do this. And so,
the truest leap of faith.
Yeah, in some ways, right? So I guess what I'm getting at, though, is that, at least for me, again, personally, that was the necessary shift in mentality that allowed me to be open to new kinds of circumstances and new orientations that have reciprocally opened my whole way of being in the world. And if I'd sat there being like, well, but, it doesn't make sense at this level or whatever, then, you're not going to make those things possible. So there's so much kind of potential for this orientation for people to re-find and reconnect with really profound, significant ways of being in the world. And I think that in some ways, certainly for some people, it can be the crucial link between a nihilism and a full sense of meaning again, right? And I wrote a book on this called Building the Cathedral, which was all about personal myth, right? Because you were talking about the stories and stuff that we live by. And sort of like, it's not true, I guess. And I mean, this is an interesting thing too. Like, things can be or not be true at many sorts of different levels, right? Like, I was just talking to someone recently, and they talked about where they've been recently as an underworld experience, and now they're coming out of the underworld and this sort of thing, right? Well, is that true or not? Well, it's obviously metaphorical. On the other hand, someone could say, no, the real story there is that guy's just been a lazy jerk living in his mother's basement for 5 years, and she's finally kicking him out. And now he's telling himself, well, I've been in the underworld, but now I've got to go find my way. It's like, which story is true? Well, there's certainly a more mundane version, but especially if that story that's being told to someone by themselves actually gets them out of an underworld, I think that story is more true. And then this is a life of pi dynamic. Anyway, again, this is what I mean by the going into the weeds, because there's a whole thing here where
I love it. You, so much of what you just talked about is in the last 5 minutes is gold. Is like, I wish I could touch on every single point. The thing you said about, I can't paraphrase you, but it reminded me of Henry Ford's quote, whether you think you can or you can't, you're right. There's something that seems trite about that, like, it seems very shallow and trivial, but it's strange that it's like it states something profound, but in a way that you can't really access it unless you actually have tried believing something for the sake of seeing where it leads you, you know, that
Sure.
as if frame. And I think, you know, the focus on seeing as if, I think, is really instructive. There's actually a number of books I think are really important for appreciating this dynamic, the role that metaphor plays in thought. I would say metaphor is essential to abstract thought. It actually plays a systematic structural role in how we talk about abstract ideas. And there's a couple of books I would recommend to anyone who is interested in learning more about that. One of them is called Metaphors We Live By. Fantastic book about the systematicity of metaphor. And another one is called The Rule of Metaphor. It's actually about the mechanics, how metaphor actually works, and the various theories on offer in linguistics as to how it works, what it does.
Very cool. Yeah.
But definitely, I think those are really like learning more about metaphor and about this actual, like, what's going on cognitively when you see something as.
Yeah.
I think is really important, because there's a real. I think of that as almost like the essence of the power of the imagination is to see something as and act as if it is that.